Chapter 11, Karma. Nick winked at Harry and had a confident grin when this happened because he knew very well that there was nothing that the Dursleys could do in this situation. The entire class including the teacher stood witness that it was Dudley and his gang who approached him, as well as the fact he didn't yell nor even stand up. Nick very much doubted that an idiot like Dudley considered this, however, when he went and complained to his parents that Nick scared him. In fact, Nick was very much looking forward to the look on the Dursleys' faces when he explained all this to the principal. The secretary who was escorting Nick secretly noted how confident he was, and when put together with the story that had circulated around the staff of yesterday's event, she couldn't blame him. His teacher had indeed seen the entire event play out, since they were very aware of Dudley's bully tendencies but helpless to stop them, as the Dursleys threw a fit every time he was reported. Instead, the teachers simply broke it up before it could get physical normally, which kept things quiet. As odd as Dudley's retreat was, literally nothing happened beyond a few calmly spoken words on Nick's part. When the door to the principal's office was opened by the secretary, Nick got his first look at the entire Dursley family. I have to admit that J.K. Rowling totally nailed their looks, he thought calmly. Vernon Dursley was a portly man with an obese face and no neck, while his face was oily and scrunched up like a bulldog and a thick moustache under his large nose. Petunia Dursley, on the other hand, was freakishly thin with an abnormally long neck and overly make-upped bird-like face. "You must be the demon who terrorized my poor Dudders," Petunia shrieked at Nick angrily. The woman's shriek clearly irritated the principal, if the bulging vein on the side of his forehead was any indication. Nick calmly walked into the room and greeted the principal respectfully before asking why he was called out of class. "The Dursleys have lodged a complaint that during the hours of school yesterday you bullied their son Dudley, and so you were called up to get to the bottom of the matter," the principal said neutrally. "I see, and might I inquire as to how exactly I did such a thing?" Nick asked calmly. "Are you calling my boy a liar?" Vernon asked venomously when he heard Nick's question. Nick shook his head. "Not once did I say such a thing. What I asked was the reasonable question of how I bullied your child. Is that not correct, Mr. Principal?" Nick looked at the principal, who agreed, making Vernon turn red in rage. Since the question was reasonably raised, perhaps Dudley himself can clarify exactly what occurred yesterday during class, the principal said calmly while focusing on the boy in question. Vernon impatiently looked at his silent child. "Well, boy, hurry up and tell the man the truth so we can get this farce over with," the man said in a tone that brokered no arguments. Dudley Dursley had somehow, even with his limited brain cells, realized that something was wrong when Nick hadn't been punished, and he was now being told to explain what happened yesterday. "I told him to stay away from my freak cousin, and he glared at me while asking how he was a freak. It felt like he was going to kill me," Dudley said hysterically. Nick tutted when Dudley finished speaking, and the two Dursley adults realized that this wasn't going to end well for them. Neither were truly stupid, unlike their son, and immediately noticed that the problem with his story, he called Harry a freak and was glared at for it. It would seem that Dudley forgot to add quite a few details necessary to illuminate this issue. "Might I clarify?" Nick asked the principal with a malicious grin. The man agreed before the Dursleys could interject, and Nick started speaking completely calmly. "You see, I was having a conversation with my new friend Harry Potter when Dudley approached us both with his own friends without any provocation. He called my new friend a freak, and I of course was upset about it and did indeed glare at him from my seat without getting up and without raising my voice. I calmly asked him how Harry was a freak. The answer he gave me was that Harry was a freak because that's what his parents told him." Vernon looked like he was about to interject, but a stern look from the principal silenced him. "I then clarified that I had not asked what his parents said, but rather for clarification on how Harry was a freak. He left angrily when he could not come up with an answer while I remained in my seat," Nick explained, and the two adult Dursleys were pale after hearing the entire story. Chapter 12, Karma 2. "It's his word against Dudley's, and they're no proof at all," Vernon said in a last-ditch attempt to save his reputation. All thoughts of punishing Nick were gone from the man's head after hearing the full story from Nick, as he could tell that Dudley was very much on the wrong side of justice here. Rather than trying to punish Nick, he was instead trying to save his own skin, as this event had the potential to expose the truth of his home life, including the way he treated his nephew-in-law. Nick's grin grew and Vernon suddenly felt like he was a juicy steak being eyed by a lion, making him nervous. What Nick said next was the final nail that made this situation irredeemable and sealed the coffin shut. On the contrary, it's the entire class, including the teacher's word against Dudley, and please don't forget that his story also corroborates my own, just with less detail, Nick said, and Vernon honestly wanted to strangle his son for his foolish act of provoking this demon called Nicholas Iron. It sounds as though this entire meeting was a waste of my time and that I will need to be calling child services about Mr. Potter's treatment. Expect a visit shortly at your residence, the principal said with a neutral tone. Things are about to get magical in this case, because there is no way in hell Dumbledore isn't going to freak out when this matter reaches him. Nick thought with a bit of anticipation, as he knew that the old mindfucker is definitely going to investigate the cause of the change in status quo, which is to say Nick himself. While this put Nick in danger, it also ensured that the old man would definitely be sending him a Hogwarts letter if he wasn't already. Nick was dismissed back to his class, and the secretary who was escorting him back was in awe of him, as she had been eavesdropping on the meeting and heard him control the whole meeting smoothly. He's going to go far in life, she thought honestly. When Nick walked into the classroom with the smug victorious grin, everyone knew that Dudley had fucked up and chose the wrong target. It was a sort of rule that you don't defy Dudley because his parents will always bail him out, but Nick had clearly turned that on its head with the look on his face as he casually strolled to his desk next to Harry. "What did you do?" Harry asked excitedly, as the curiosity was killing him and the rest of the class, who went quiet to listen in, even the teacher. Nick then regaled them with the tale of how he force-fed the Dursleys a taste of their own medicine and might have exposed Harry's terrible treatment as well. "Brilliant," Harry said with a genuine smile of happiness when he heard the story, and truly hoped that he gets sent to the same orphanage as Nick. Nick had trouble holding his laughter when Harry told him this, as he couldn't help imagining Dumbledore getting a letter telling him this and having a heart attack. It would not be strange, since he would then feel the need to watch out for signs of Harry growing in a way similar to Voldemort and turning evil. Nick knew that was impossible due to how good-natured Harry was, but it was still a funny idea. He didn't shut down Harry's hopes though, since he honestly couldn't just tell Harry that all of his misery was because of a scheming old goat and the evil known as prophecies. Much like one would expect when Child Protective Services showed up at number 4 Privet Drive and searched the house, they were not happy at all. At first glance it looked like a good place to live, and Dudley's room was the picture of a well-taken care of child's room. That was where the problem came in, however, as the only other room was completely barren and had obviously not been lived in at all. This led the social worker to question the Dursleys and learn where exactly Harry was living, in a dirty broom closet under the stairs. Karma was swift and painful on this day for the Dursleys, as the news got a hold of the story somehow and ran with it. Harry was reimbursed for his suffering with a single request, which he used to go to the same orphanage as Nick, and the Dursleys were ruined reputation-wise all within a single afternoon. Dumbledore was far too late to stop any of this, however, because the person he had placed to watch over Harry and the Dursleys was coincidentally out when it all went down, leaving him helpless. Chapter 13 Unforeseen Talent. Dumbledore followed the trail of memories he casually looked through of the Dursleys and easily found the source of the sudden change. A young boy of 10 years old who, turning 11 in March, old enough to join Hogwarts with Harry, he noted offhandedly. The old wizard watched the events play out from the perspective of each of the Dursleys and could only nod in appreciation over the control and presence the young boy commanded in the meeting that created this scenario. He was clearly enjoying the way he had the family dancing in his palm, but clearly he wasn't arrogant, as he didn't flaunt his victory at them. What an interesting little fellow, Dumbledore thought in amusement after perusing the family's memory of the event, but then he dug deeper into the child, Dudley, he notes, memory of the initial confrontation and froze. He recognized what it was that struck terror into the Muggle child immediately: pure magic. As a wizard who was exposed to the energy on a daily basis at Hogwarts, the headmaster was astonished to see it involved in this matter, even if not in a conventional sense. He clearly is some pure blood scion planted near Harry, since it is clear that this outburst of magic is not very well controlled, much like a hammer rather than a scalpel. Dumbledore dissected Nick's use of his magic at a single glance. Looks like I should also check this boy to see if he might turn out like him. The old wizard decided seriously. Normally he didn't bother himself with orphan wizards, but clearly Nick was far too talented to be just another orphan wizard, and he was now friends with Harry Potter to boot. Dumbledore casually apparated away, leaving no one aware he was even there beyond a loud pop. The orphanage was quite lively when Dumbledore arrived near it, as all the children and caretakers were smothering Harry with positive attention. I suppose this will serve as a good way to get him used to the fame he'll have next year, the old wizard thought in amusement as he watched Harry struggle to cope with being the center of attention. The headmaster of course went through Harry's memories of Nick as well, and he was happy with what he found. What a good fellow. He even knows how to make jewelry and has been nothing but kind to Harry, the old wizard thought appreciatively. Dumbledore didn't find it odd at all that Nick knew how to craft jewelry, as talented people have been doing seemingly abnormal things like that for as long as such people have existed. It helped that it showed the old wizard that Nick probably had an exceptional talent for enchanting, as most with that talent tend to learn a craft young as well. A big problem showed up however when Dumbledore tried to use legilimency on Nick, only for him to be trapped in the memory of his sister Ariana dying over and over. When the mental retaliation ended, Dumbledore visibly looked slightly older and was covered in sweat. What in Merlin's name just happened? The Supreme Mugwump thought in horror that only grew when he saw Nick look at the ring on his hand in confusion and then realization before looking around cautiously. He enchanted the ring to protect his mind. How? Dumbledore thought in terror of the talent needed for such a thing. Tom has nothing on this young man in terms of talent. I'll need to keep a close eye on him, the old wizard thought seriously before apparating away, not noticing that Nick was acting when he looked around. Nick had sensed the old wizard the moment he showed up thanks to his sensitivity to magic, and Dumbledore was like a fucking lighthouse with the amount of the stuff he was letting off passively. The old man's disillusionment charm was totally useless against Nick, and in truth merely made him a bit more vicious in his retaliation when Sana reacted to the old man's attempt at probing his mind. The automatic defense merely tears apart the magic probe normally, but Nick instead used it to send a repeating memory of the worst experience the old goat ever had. Glad that's over with at least. Waiting for that guy to make his move was getting harder and harder, Nick thought in relief. He had been expecting Dumbledore's visit for hours at this point, and even a patient person like him was starting to grow a bit paranoid. I may have overdone it a bit with the retaliation though, Nick thought sheepishly. I'll get him some woolen socks for Christmas in my first year as an apology, he decided, since everyone remembered that line in the books. Chapter 14, Recycling. Nick was made to share a room with Harry at the orphanage since they clearly got along well. Not that either of them minded. Nick didn't mind because Harry already knew about his crafting ability, as well as the fact that they will both end up going to Hogwarts together the next year, and knowing Dumbledore end up in the same house and room. Both of them are practically guaranteed to be placed in Gryffindor, with their personalities being what they were. Nick was a bit special in this regard, as he could actually fit in no matter the house he was placed in. After all, he was cunning and ambitious like Slytherin, courageous like Gryffindor, wise like Ravenclaw, and loyal and hard-working like Hufflepuff. In a scenario like this, Nick imagined that his own input would be the deciding factor for the Sorting Hat, and sadly Gryffindor is simply the best option. The amount of favoritism stacked on Gryffindor's side during Harry's school years was simply too great not to try and take advantage of. Sure, it came with a few large downsides, including a great deal of danger, but the benefits made it all worth it. Additionally, it would probably also make Dumbledore much less suspicious of him in the long run, since majority of that house are heroic individuals rather than villains. One of the biggest downsides in Nick's opinion, however, had to be the sheer amount of idiots or carefree people in the house that would undoubtedly try and distract him and Harry with games and other useless things. A week passed by after that, and the Dursleys had packed up and left the area, taking Dudley with them as they couldn't stand the looks people gave them. This meant that the school district was free from Dudley's bullying, which was celebrated by both the staff and students. Nick felt like an idiot at the end of the week when Harry asked him why he hadn't tried to find scrap to turn into jewelry. For Harry it was a simple solution, but Nick had totally ignored the idea at all, since he was under the false impression that the materials needed to be good to create rings. Honestly, should probably try and make something out of scrap to see if the system counts it. Harry is already making the decision to befriend him, a nice one. Good work past me, Nick thought, patting his own back. On Saturday, Nick and Harry left the orphanage to go looking for scrap metal that may be useful. Muggle London in the early 90s was a fantastic place for metal hunters to go looking, because the stuff was getting tossed out daily alongside actual rubbish. Cans, silverware, cooking utensils, car parts and even construction pieces. The two of them found tin, silver, iron, steel and copper in large enough quantities for Nick to have plenty of workable material for a good minute. The folks at the local metal refinery were more than happy to help the boys melt down the scrap into small ingots. They were impressed at the initiative Nick and Harry had shown, and even the owner of the refinery chipped in to help shape the steel into a rough set of tongs and hammers for them once they learned what the boys wanted the metal for. The only thing the men of the refinery wanted in exchange was a piece of jewelry each as payment. They needed to get some paper and a pencil so Nick could measure each of their ring sizes, but otherwise he saw no problem at all with this arrangement. The caretaker at the orphanage was confused when the two boys returned with tools and metal ingots. But when she heard what they were for, she was more than happy to clear out the old shed behind the building for them to work in, as it had a fireplace that Nick could use to heat the metal. Nick absent-mindedly noted that if there was one thing that English folk never snubbed, it was young folk wanting to get into crafting. The only thing I'm missing is something to work as an anvil, and I should be able to get started, Nick thought while looking at the shabby makeshift workshop. Nick got lucky 2 days later when the school bus passed by a new construction site and he saw a pile of scraps that just so happened to have a chunk of steel beam about a foot long at its edge. It was quite the walk from the orphanage, but Nick eventually got there in the evening and convinced the site foreman to turn it over to him. The walk back to the orphanage was a bitch and a half, but it was totally worth it to Nick as he now had a usable workshop. Chapter 15, Crafting Lesson. Chill mate, you seem more excited about finally using the workshop than me, Nick joked with Harry, who was already starting to recover from his malnourishment after a week at the orphanage. He wasn't at a healthy weight just yet, but at least he wasn't nearly as scrawny as he was when Nick first met him. How are you not excited? Harry asked in exasperation. That was the one trait that Harry was trying his hardest to break Nick out of, how unexpressive he was. It was clear to Harry that Nick was a very reserved individual and had trouble truly relaxing in the past week they've lived together, and it bothered him. Harry knew all about keeping quiet so as to avoid attention. The Dursleys made sure of that. But Nick's silence was completely unnecessary and felt wrong to Harry, like the very thought of relaxing his guard scared Nick. He didn't know what had happened to make Nick like this, but he didn't need to in order to try and help his friend recover from it. I am reasonably excited about finally getting to work, but you don't even know how to craft, so it's weird how eager you are about it, Nick said with a roll of his eyes. You're going to be turning scrap we found in the rubbish into literal treasure. What's not to be excited about? Harry asked rhetorically with a smug look, since he knew he won this discussion. Nick could only raise his hands in defeat, since they both knew that Harry had a point and he had lost the battle. I promise you'll change your tune when I actually get started, since the whole process is honestly kinda boring, he said with a smirk. Harry looked less confident. It can't be that bad, right? He thought worriedly. An hour after school, Harry entered the shabby workshop with Nick excitedly, only to be left stunned when he lit the fireplace and fed it for 30 whole minutes. Don't look at me like that. Getting a strong hot fire going is an important step with no shortcuts with what we have available, Nick said with a small chuckle when he saw how bored Harry looked. So we literally have to waste so much time even ring just for you to get started? the boy asked with a dread-filled expression. Nah, just the first ring, mate. The fire's job is merely to help keep the metal workable for longer after it reaches temp. The fun bit really comes when I'm shaping the metal into their chosen designs. Nick explained patiently while tossing a copper ingot into the roaring fire. Thank God, I thought it was always going to be so boring. So how long does the metal take to heat up? Harry asked curiously while wiping the sweat from his forehead. Nick shrugged. It depends on the metal, some are hard and take longer to get workable like steel, while others are naturally soft and get hot quickly like this copper ingot here that's already done heating up. He explained as he used a pair of rough tongs to pick up the glowing ingot. Nick brought the ingot over to his makeshift anvil and carefully put it against the middle of it so he could shape it a bit. Now you will see the preliminary needed to make a ring. See how this piece of metal is so large? He asked calmly. Yeah, what about it? Harry asked interested. Nick started to strike the metal while making sure to keep it still with the tongs. I need to make this large piece of metal into a bunch of smaller pieces since a single ring usually doesn't use a lot of metal and this is far too much. Right now what I am doing by hammering the metal is called drawing it out. Watch for a bit and it should become clear, Nick said without taking his eyes off the ingot or stopping his hammer strikes. Harry watched in amazement as the ingot got thinner with each strike but also longer as well. Nick stopped after 5 minutes and put the metal that was nearly twice its original length and half its height into the fire again. He then turned to Harry. So did you figure it out yet? He asked curiously. By drawing out the metal it gets easier to obtain just the right amount when you break it into different pieces, right? Harry asked seriously. Something like that, yeah? A small correction is that I won't be breaking the metal but segmenting exactly. Nick answered honestly. What's the difference? Harry asked confused. Segmenting is precise while breaking is not. If I was just messing around, breaking the metal would be fine. But since I already have a design in mind, segmenting works better. Nick explained patiently. Chapter 16, Crafting Lesson 2. Like your ring? Harry asked, pointing at Nick's right hand where Sanar sat upon his pointer finger glinting slightly in the fire's light. Nick shook his head. I was thinking of making them shaped like Smith hammers with the handles forming the band, he said honestly. Harry looked enlightened because they work with metal, he said excitedly as he understood Nick's thought process. Yeah, figured they'd get a kick out of it too. I'll admit that it also helps that it's a simple enough design as well, Nick said with a chuckle before grabbing the metal out of the fire since it was warmed up again. Once again he carefully struck the metal until it gained some more length while losing some thickness. Nick raised the metal once he got near the thickness he wanted to spot check it for evenness, which he then hammered out if he found spots too thick. Once the metal was uniform in thickness he set it aside and grabbed an ingot of iron and tossed it into the fire. Why did you put that other piece of metal in the fire? Harry asked confused. Nick wiped away his own sweat and leaned against the wall of the shed. Since iron takes longer to heat up, I need that iron to make a temporary chisel to segment the copper without damaging the proportions. Most smiths tend to do similar things if they find that they lack a specific tool. He explained honestly. So if you need a tool you just make it rather than going to get it? Harry asked, having trouble grasping the idea. If I have the skill and the material, why wouldn't I just make the tool instead of having someone else make them? Nick asked rhetorically. Harry seemed to finally get it and nodded in agreement. That does make sense. He admits. We are going to be here for quite a while. Iron takes a bit to heat up to a workable temp, Nick said casually. Harry sagged in disappointment. Is every crafting session this boring? He asked in exasperation. Nick laughed. Man, he is going to hate potions if he's this impatient. Nick paused mid-thought. Well, more so than just because Snape is going to be breathing down his neck. He corrected. Tell you what, mate, you go entertain yourself somehow and just leave the crafting to me and I'll show you the finished product later, all right? Nick suggested in hopes of giving his friend out without Harry needing to sound rude. Probably for the best. I don't think it's for me, Nick. Harry admitted with a sigh. Nick just smiled reassuringly. It's not for a lot of people, don't worry about it, it's no skin off my back, he said with a shrug. Nick remembered first reading the Harry Potter series back in his old life and laughing at how the trio's impulsivity got them into trouble. Never thought I'd see it for myself, he thought with a bit of melancholy. Nick didn't lie to anyone about his memories during his time in this world, as beyond the name this body held there was nothing left over of its previous owner. That said, the memories of his old life still remained but were starting to quickly fade as more time went on. He had a theory that this world was actively trying to expunge memories of a different world since it defied the laws of this one. This also explained why his knowledge of the books weren't affected, as by this world's laws it might be considered a type of divination into a possible future. Kinda sucks that I can't keep any important details of my past life since they could come in handy, but it is what it is, Nick thought with a sigh. He looked over at Harry, confused. Why are you still here? He asked, making Harry realize that he actually had no clue, and walk out of the shed with an embarrassed look. Nick just chuckled at his awkwardness and went back to patiently waiting for the iron to heat up. It took 10 minutes, mostly because a fire in a fireplace can only be kept so hot by feeding it. Picking the metal up with a pair of cold tongs, Nick placed the block of iron on the makeshift anvil and immediately raised his hammer before bringing it down on one of the block's corners. Repeating this over and over again, Nick slowly changed that side of the block into a wedge shape that he then carefully beveled into a dull blade-like shape, making an ugly but functional chisel. He then ignored it and tossed the copper back into the fire to bring it up to temp again. Chapter 17, Dilemma. Nick didn't need the metal super hot like he would if he was going to work it, merely hot enough that it doesn't get cracked from the chisel. Once hot enough, Nick took the metal out of the fire and picked up the chisel before carefully lining it up. Cut off a strip of material close to 7 mm wide. Nick then hit the blunt side of the chisel with his hammer, cutting that strip from the rest. He repeated this process until the billet of copper had been cut into 24, 7 mm wide and 2.5 inch long strips about 2.5 mm thick. The rest of the shaping process was easy after that, as he merely needed to heat the strips to a workable temp before gently tapping on one end of them, causing the other to widen and form a mushroom-like shape. Once the mushroom's cap was the right size, Nick flattened the edges until the mushroom cap now was rectangular, like a smith's hammer. After that, it was merely a matter of repeating the process for the rest and them curving the handle, forming a ring shape that was then sized based on the list he had gotten from the men at the refinery. Once that was done, Nick found himself with a problem of conflict between what he wants to do as the craftsman and what he should do as a wizard. On one side, his instincts as a magical craftsman were telling him that the rings needed to be enchanted, while his brain told him he would get in a huge amount of trouble if the ministry found out he knowingly gave enchanted objects to muggles. This was quite the dilemma for Nick, as he was equally torn between logic and emotion. As much as it pains me to admit, the risk of enchanting these rings is just too heavy. I can't tempt fate and getting sent to Azkaban just to satisfy myself, he thought with a heavy heart, and started to polish the rings to remove any rough edges. They weren't flawless store-quality pieces, but Nick was satisfied with them appearance-wise. The system apparently automatically knew he was done with these rings and popped up a series of notifications. These notifications told him that he got a certain amount of ring points for making these rings. They weren't worth many points, as he only got 3 for each of the rings, which multiplied by the fact there were 24 of them gave Nick 72 points total. In addition to the 28 points he had left from creating Sanai, he now had 100 points even. This was just enough to let him buy a single mystery ticket if so chose, or 2 pieces of basic equipment like a hammer and tong. Nick would be lying if he said he wasn't interested in testing his luck with the mystery ticket, but decided to hold on to the points for now. As promised, Nick wrapped the rings in a piece of cloth and brought them out of the shed after dousing the fire to show Harry. Harry was in their shared room on his bed reading one of Nick's books, thinking it was a fantasy book rather than a school book for the upcoming year. Specifically a history of magic by Bathilda Bagshot, which was an ironic choice considering how hated that class was according to the books. "You certainly look comfortable," Nick said, getting Harry's attention while peeling his sweat-soaked shirt off and into the clothes hamper. "Did you finish?" Harry asked, instantly growing excited as he bent the ear of the page he was on and closed the book, much to Nick's horror. "Don't bend the ear like that or you'll ruin the book," he said angrily. Harry held his hands up in surrender. "Okay. "Geez, no need to get so miffed," he said defensively as he undid the bent ear and used a torn piece of paper as a bookmark. "To answer your question though, yes, I did finish the rings. Here," Nick said, tossing the bundle of rings to Harry, who caught it no problem. The boy opened the bundle but had a confused look when he saw the rings in it. "Isn't jewelry supposed to be shiny?" he asked in confusion. Nick laughed. "Depends on a few factors really. First is who is meant to receive the jewelry. Second is what it is made from, and finally whether the person who made it has the ability to make it shiny." The answers to those questions in order are metalworkers, copper, and not with the setup I currently have, Nick said honestly. Chapter 18, Close Call. "What does them working on metal have to do with this?" Harry asked, as the rest he understood just fine. "When we were at the refinery, how would you describe the men there?" Nick asked patiently, and Harry thought about it for a minute before he figured it out. "Dirty," he said in realization. Nick nodded with a grin. "Smoke, metal dust, sweat and dirt is the price those men pay by working in that job. So the way I see it, something shiny is pointless for them, as it too will just get dirty. So instead I made something symbolic instead," Nick said proudly. Harry nodded in agreement. "It's brilliant," he said excitedly. "We'll make a trip on Saturday to give the blokes the rings and I'm sure they'll agree," Nick said with a grin. "For now though I need a bath," Nick said with a grimace as he smelt himself. Harry burst into laughter at this, but Nick just ignored it as he went into the bathroom. "I want to finish that blank of mine, but I can't risk any of the others seeing me work and getting the ministry's attention," Nick thought with a sigh as he scrubbed himself thoroughly with the soap. He winced a bit when he went over the healing bruises on his body, but otherwise finished up quickly and got changed into a set of plain grey cotton pajamas. He and Harry talked about a history of magic for the rest of the day until dinner, after which they turned in for the night. The next day was Friday and school was as always a torturously boring event for Nick, but he sucked it up. Neither he nor Harry did anything for the rest of that day beyond delve into their own chosen books and relax. Saturday though was a whole different matter, as they packed up the rings in a small cardboard box Miss Smith had given them for it and set out to go deliver the rings. It never ceased to amaze Nick how many people actually walked everywhere in London. Nobody seemed to bat an eye at the two boys as they moved with the flow of foot traffic towards their destination at a brisk walking speed. What did catch people's attention, however, was a strangely dressed man in a bright Hawaiian floral shirt and baggy sweatpants who apparently thought he was blending in. "If that's not a wizard, I'll eat my shoes," Nick thought with a grimace, and began steering Harry clear of where the man was. Thankfully the wizard just continued minding his business and didn't bother the boys at all. That guy must be balmy to walk around like that, Harry gossiped after he was sure that they had left the man's hearing range. Nick shrugged. "I don't know, maybe he just found the clothes comfortable?" he offered non-committal. Harry laughed at that response. "Think he might have escaped the loony bin?" he asked jokingly. "You aren't that far off really," Nick thought to himself when he heard the question. What he said though was no clue really. "I just hope he doesn't cause any trouble." This wasn't a lie either, as if the wizard made a mistake and used magic without thinking, the ministry's obliviators would get involved, and that spelt trouble for him and Harry. While most of the time those people only targeted muggles who saw what they shouldn't have, a few cases may involve them needing to erase all evidence of a wizard's passing, which was to say everyone who saw them. Nick wasn't willing to test if Sana held up against brute force attack spells on his mind. He knew very well that the ring had a limit to how much it could resist that wasn't very high due to his lack of skill and experience. "I'll reforge it later when I get much better at using the crafting style," Nick vowed mentally. Thankfully no obliviators showed up and the two boys made it to the metal refinery without any issue an hour later. The workers were happy to see the two of them and asked how their project worked out. Harry here found out that the work wasn't for him, but otherwise it went great. "We even brought the rings we promised," Nick said excitedly, leaving the workers stunned. "To be fair lad, we didn't actually expect you to go and really make us rings," the boss said with an awkward chuckle. Nick frowned. "I gave my word and that meant I was going to follow through," he said, slightly offended. The boss raised his hands in surrender. "Didn't mean to upset you lad. I've no doubts about your honor, but you can understand not expecting a couple of wee lads like yourself to do such hard work." "I?" The man said calmly. Chapter 19, Appreciation and Time Skip. It's fine I guess, it just hurt a little to be doubted like that is all, he said honestly. The workers all nod in understanding. A man's gotta take his word seriously, so the fault here is ours, lad. Can I ask for forgiveness? The boss asked sincerely. Nick nodded. All right, I'll forgive you all this time, but don't let it happen again. Agreed, he said seriously, and the workers pat their chest in agreement. Enough about that though, who wants to see the rings? Nick asked with a grin as he shook the box lightly. The workers were all eager to see what Nick had made for them and emptied the box on a messy table nearby. The men were interested when the copper rings landed on the table, and one of them picked up a ring curiously. They're designed after hammers and thanks to the material are easy to clean and fix. Each ring has the size written on its hammerhead. Nick explained with a smile. The men quickly divided the rings up and admired them on their own fingers happily. Copper hammers, eh? Got a nice ring to it, lad. The boss said with a smile as he looked at the orange ring on his finger. Thought you all would get a kick out of it, Nick said with a smirk. It's hard to believe a squirt like you made stuff like this, but it's got all the marks of the work, so well done. The boss said honestly. Nick smirked. You haven't seen anything, he thought while rubbing Sanar with his thumb. Harry had no problem socializing with the workers despite them being dirty and smelly, as he was just happy to be acknowledged. Nick couldn't help but think that this may be why Hagrid was one of Harry's favorite people. The half-giant didn't see race or color or house or bloodline, all he saw was people, and that alone made him better than most wizards alive. Nick and Harry hang out with the refinery workers for about an hour before heading back to the orphanage. After that they simply played chess for most of the day, with Nick coming out on top the entire time. Time passed and 3.5 months came and went after this, with Nick forging rings in the workshop while slowly improving his skills and otherwise enjoying his time with Harry. His injuries had fully healed in this time, and thanks to his forging his body was now much stronger than before. Harry had also recovered from his malnutrition, mostly as the signs of it were mostly gone and only the parts created from its long-term effects could be seen. Nick had stuck to his guns and never enchanted any of the rings he made, while also destroying most of them after the system paid him for them so he could reuse the materials they were made out of. The date was now July 25, 1990, and Nick finally decided to enchant a ring, since in 6 more days it was Harry's birthday. He had stockpiled quite the amount of points by now, as even though he only forged 3 rings a day, since he wanted quality over quantity, unlike the rings he made for the refinery workers. Each of those rings were worth more as a result, with the best quality silver ring he had made so far being worth 25 points. In total he had made 336 rings during this time, with 100 being worth 10 points, 56 worth 12, 89 worth 15, 10 worth 16, 20 worth 17, 30 worth 19, 15 worth 20, 10 worth 22, 3 worth 23, 2 worth 24 and 1 worth 25. This gave him a grand total of 4,839 ring points, since he hasn't purchased anything with them in this time. This sounds like a lot, but in reality it was barely enough for him to purchase a basic Muggle set of equipment. The prices of the larger things like the forge were horribly expensive, with the basic small Muggle forge costing 1,000 points alone. Rather than purchase such a thing and have to leave it behind when he went to Hogwarts next year, Nick instead was saving up for something he found while scrolling through the shop one day. One-time use enchantment model, storage space, 3 cubic meters, price, 5,000 ring points. Nick was astonished when he discovered that rather than needing to custom make each enchantment, he could instead use the much less flexible system enchantments for an expensive price. Chapter 20, Ota. Nick had a sneaking suspicion that the reason he didn't have his inventory space open in the system is that he needed an actual storage area in order for it to work. Once he saved up enough points to buy this enchantment from the system, he would find out. For now though, I need to figure out what I want to put on Harry's ring. Nick thought seriously. I don't want to just copy Sanara's, that might force the old man to take drastic measures. I also want the enchantment to be genuinely useful for Harry as well. Nick thought with a frown. Nick spent an entire day in deep thought, which worried Harry quite a bit, since even though he knew Nick often got lost in thought, it was never this bad. This changed when one of the kids in the orphanage hit him with a ball on accident, and something seemed to click for Nick and he was suddenly very animate. Harry never spoke about the oddities he had noticed from Nick, but that didn't mean he didn't notice small things that confused him. One such thing was how Nick seemed to stop himself from really saying what he is thinking. The worst one has to be the moments that he suddenly seems to know way more than anyone else for no explainable reason. These strange and fantastical books he has for some reason, for example, make Nick amused to see him reading for some reason, and Harry had no clue why. Nick disappeared into the workshop that had become a sort of no-fly zone in the orphanage after one of the other kids hurt themselves messing with the tools. Harry avoided the workshop mostly because it was always uncomfortable in there, and he was bored to tears the entire time, since he just didn't have the patience to sit there mindlessly waiting. So when Nick locked the doors to the workshop, no one was aware of it. The windows were too high up for anyone to peep through, and it was during the day, so any extra brightness would mostly go unnoticed. Nick retrieved the bird-shaped ring blank from his pocket and set it against the small anvil he had gotten by stockpiling steel for a month before having the refinery folks smelt it into shape. Here goes nothing, he thought nervously as he once again began to glow as he executed the true potency of his crafting style. Nick's mind, soul and body had stabilized a week after he and Harry gave the refinery workers their rings, causing his magic to also stop growing so quickly and return to a agonizingly slow crawl. Thanks to this stabilization, however, Nick had a far easier time controlling his spirit in the correct way, bringing the glow onto his hands. Unlike Celebrimbor, however, Nick was unable to limit it to his hammer hand, wasting about 2/3 of the amount of energy he was using. He knew this, however, and immediately began to will his understanding of shields and defense into his spirit, which subtly changed its frequency. Without wasting a moment, Nick swung his hammer down onto the ring. Unlike what one would expect, however, the ring was undamaged and didn't move at all, as though the blow was a lie. The echoing ring of metal striking metal, however, told a very different story. One blow after another began to rain down upon the ring, and with them a burst of pure white light erupted from the ring, small at first but larger as more strikes fell. Ota. Nick spoke, and a single elvish word appeared on the ring, and as Nick struck the ring again, the word appeared in the burst of energy. Melon. Nick spoke a new word which appeared on the ring as well as the burst of energy. The energy was nearly blinding at this point, and Nick knew he was running out of energy, and with his last bit of power spoke the final word to appear on the ring, Korma, and immediately passed out from the exertion. Nick woke up an hour later as his body barely recovered enough to function. There upon the anvil lay the bird ring, calmly humming as it waited patiently for its creator to name it and finish it. Nick stood shakily and spoke with a tired but authoritarian voice, "You are Ota." And the words appeared once again, both this time in specific locations on the ring. The word Ota was on the left ring, the word melon on the body, and the word Corman on the right ring. With this the ring was complete, and unlike Sanar, this ring was far superior, as it was made using a slightly more advanced technique from the crafting style that Nick realized halfway through the forging he wasn't ready for yet.